Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's installment of the Roth webinar series. We're just going to give it a few more minutes to let some other folks join, and then we'll get the webinar started. We've got a few more people who have joined. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes. Okay, well, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for another in our Roth IAMS webinar series. Today's presentation is going to be a big one with lots of information in it. But don't worry, following the webinar, we are going to be sending out a correspondence with a link to the presentation, as well as a video recording of today's presentation. So you'll get a deck and a recording. So I hope that allows you to pay attention and be engaged, because Johnny Moore, facility assessor at Roth IAMS, and our resident expert in ADA is going to take us through a presentation called The Risks of Not Being ADA Compliant, and give us an introduction to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So stay tuned. We will have questions and answers at the end, so please utilize the chat and put them in there. And stay on with us when the webinar completes to do a survey that helps us develop more and better webinars. So I'm going to turn it over to Johnny now. Take it away, Johnny.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the seminar, the webinar. Today I want to talk to you about the ADA. I've been doing ADA for about 20 years, so I guess due to the experience that I have and the knowledge that I've obtained over those years, I'm deemed as being pretty qualified and know what I'm doing. Today, I want to talk to you about the history and definition and the purpose, which is basically the who, what, when, where, why of ADA, what it's all about. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the explanation of the titles and codes governing the ADA, proving and demonstrating that it is something that is mandated by the federal government. It is a law. It's a series of laws. We'll talk about the 2010 ADA standards of accessible design, the overview of the ADA applications and procedures. I'll do that by demonstrating some sections out of that guideline. I'll give you some examples of the ADA issues and concerns that are going to lead to what are called ADA fails. And those fails are going to be the cause of potential risk for not being compliant with the ADA codes and guidelines. Just as a disclaimer, it's just to be understood that nothing that I say here is binding with any particular agency or enforcement under the responsibility of the ADA. The session is, however, authorized by the ADA and the U.S. Access Board. We'll go over, first of all, the history, definition, and purpose. And the thing I want you to understand is that there is a lot of information I'm going to fly through here. I am not trying to teach you everything you need to know about ADA. I can't do that in an hour. What I can do is give you an overall exposure to what is involved, the kinds of things that are of major concern, and then those items will be the things that lead you to an understanding of what the risks are of not being ADA compliant. So we'll talk about the history of the ADA first of all. We're going to focus on Titles 2 and Title 3 of the ADA Code, and I'll explain what those are in a minute. Just as far as the history, understand that in the 80s, it was determined that there was a need for civil rights legislation for all persons with disabilities. And this was something that became very important to President Ronald Reagan when he was in office. He tried to establish something with the National Council on Disabilities that would enact a series of laws and codes that would provide guidelines for individuals to protect them, all those individuals who were physically challenged. They came up with the federal regulations, which have evolved through a series of changes that started not just for the ADA, but for everybody, because the ADA, it involves everybody, not just the people who are physically challenged, but the people who try to take care of the physical aspects of the buildings and facilities out there in the built environment that we're trying to protect. So who is protected by the ADA? Well, it protects all the qualified individuals with disabilities, and it protects them from discrimination. And there's a lot of different things that it protects you from, it protects you with your employment, access to state and local government facilities and buildings and services, communications, medical care. It protects everybody in this webinar. It is a complete and thorough list that includes everyone. What is an individual with a disability? They basically have a three-part definition. It's anyone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities, and I'll demonstrate what those are in a minute. Anyone who has a record of such an impairment or anyone who is regarded as having such an impairment. Those are people with disabilities. Those major life activities that we all take for granted, walking, speaking, breathing, seeing, all of these, you can see there's a lot of different life activities. And if you've got a physical impairment that is limiting you, you need to have your rights protected, And it's important to understand that there's quite a few of us that have these limitations. At last count, there were 66 million people in the United States that were deemed as having some form of disability. That's about 19% of the population, and that number is growing daily. Understanding that the U.S. Code is the code of laws in the United States that is the official compilation and codification of the general and permanent federal statutes in the United States that govern the ADA codes. The U.S. codes, there's 5 of them primarily. Again, the ones that I'm going to focus on are Titles 2 and Title 3, which are basically the built environment. This is going to be an example of some of the items that are in each one of the chapters of the ADA Bible, the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design. And it's important to understand that that is the most recent code change version that we have. That's the one we are working with. Chapter 1, Application and General Scoping. It talks about the interpretation of what the ADA is. It discusses the accessibility to sites, buildings, facilities, and all the different elements. First thing people are going to say is, especially if they're responsible for a building, much less own a building, they're going to say, well, wait a minute, what about the ADA grandfather clause? I used to be grandfathered in. Well, in the old days, you did with the first ADA code that came out in 1992 and the revised version that came out in 2004. There were exclusions or grandfather clauses that said that if your building was built prior to that, you didn't have to worry about being ADA compliant. Then in 2010, when that code came out, they said no more grandfather clauses. You have to do what you need to make your building ADA compliant. And everything that this webinar is going to discuss is going to give you the reasoning for that. This first part here is to give you an idea of the things that are included in it. So chapter 2 is the scoping. That's going to talk about entrances, how you get from the parking lot up into the building. There are always general exceptions. There are exceptions in the form of construction sites, limited access spaces, machinery spaces, water slides, animal containment areas. There's always exceptions. Building blocks, chapter 3, they're going to talk about some of the important things like the reach range. It's important to understand that if you can learn the basic dimensions in the criteria pertaining to different code criteria items in the ADA, things like the maximum reach range of 48 inches, the minimum reach range of 15 inches, that will help you learn how to look for items that are code items that you need to pay attention to. There's always variations. Obviously, if you are in a wheelchair and you are in an area where you have an obstacle like a bookcase that is only 10 inches wide or less, you're going to have that maximum reach capability of 48 inches. However, if you're leaning over a cabinet or an item that's 24 inches wide, then that reach range is going to lower down. You're only going to have 46 inches. The reason I'm showing this is to make you understand that there are a lot of different things that come into play with the ADA. It's not as simple as saying, okay, I'm going to throw a grab bar up in the restroom and that's going to make me ADA compliant. That doesn't come close. They even have children's reach ranges, and it's broken out into the different age categories, as you can see here. Operable parts, protruding objects. They talk about the fact that if you are physically challenged in the way that you have vision limitations, then you might be using a cane. You might be completely blind. People will do what's called wall surfing. They will take and walk along a wall or some object that they can take and put their cane against and use that as a guide for walking down a walkway or an accessible route. If you have an object that is above 27 inches up to 80 inches and it extends out more than 4 inches, as you can see, it could hit the individual as they are walking by. That is called a protruding object. They also have protruding objects that come in the form of overhead barriers like you see here. Protrusion limits only pertain to the items that are in direct are directly in the access route. So here you see a baby changing table. You say, well, that's probably less than 4 inches, so it's okay. Well, if you fold that baby table down, that baby changing table, it now becomes a protruding object. So you have to really focus on a lot of these items and understand that it's not just a matter of what they are, but where they are. If they are on a circulation path in the accessible route and they stick out more than 4 inches, then that is a protruding object. However, if it is not in the accessible route, like this particular item here, because it's protected by the table and the counter here, it's not in the accessible route, so it is not a protruding object. Chapter 4, the accessible routes. This is where it starts getting interesting because you're trying to figure out how you're going to get the public out from the parking lot and the drop-off points of public transportation like bus stops. How are you going to get those people safely into a building or facility? When you talk about that accessible route, it has to be on what's classified as a flat, level, and secure surface. You can't have any loose areas like gravel or anything like that. You have to have a flat, level surface. You can't have grooves that exceed a 1/4 inch in width. If you have gaps between different materials like the brick pavers here in this concrete strip, that is too wide. That is a gap that is not allowed. So again, all I'm trying to do here is show you and demonstrate that there are a lot of things that you have to think about when you're looking at providing a safe, accessible route for people from the outside to the inside. One of the things that you can do to assist you in understanding that concept is to envision being inside a big cardboard box that is 30 inches by 48 inches in width and depth, and then 84 inches in height. Basically, that is your overall safe zone. That is the clearance criteria in 99% of all the criteria listed in the ADA code. Now imagine moving that box around a site. Try going from your car inside the building, inside that box, and think about the things that you're going to hit or that are in your way or don't provide you a flat level surface to be able to negotiate that route to the inside. Connecting performing and seating areas like arenas and theaters and conference rooms. Here you can see they've got this nice gradual slope here for this ramp. They've got a temporary ramp installed here to get up onto a stage. Over here, they've got a ramp that goes beyond the seating area onto the stage. So this is providing access for everybody so that they are not cheated out of being able to attend things that you and I take for granted. This type of guidance will provide this kind of thing from happening, understanding these criteria here of having head heights so that this doesn't happen. You have to have some kind of a clear zone here that's out far enough away so that you won't hit your head on overhead obstacles. Entrances. Automated openers are recommended for exterior doors. They're most commonly requested as reasonable accommodation for all people with disabilities. And again, if you start looking at these things, you're going to notice here they've got this highlighted area here in yellow. Guess what size that is? It's 30 by 48. Like I said, if you remember some of these numbers, you're going to see that it applies in a lot of different situations. Automated doors with entrances. There's our footprint, 30 by 48. Well, you have other things that you have to think about. Once you get to the building, you have to be able to get into the door. Well, there are criteria on doors that you have to understand. In this particular case, with the door swinging into or towards the occupant, trying to get into that space, whether it's another room or a bathroom or just going outside. On the pull side of this door, you have to have at least 18 inches clear so that that person in a wheelchair can negotiate opening that door. On the push side of the door, if you're trying to get out of a room, you have to have 12 inches. Ramps and slopes have very specific criteria as far as the amount of degrees that you're allowed to have in a slope. But a lot of times you're going to find out when you start looking at the ADA and start looking at the built environment, you're going to realize that 99% of the time it's a matter of just applying common sense. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to be able to look at this particular ramp. They're trying to help the ADA, giving them a ramp to negotiate these stairs. But if you understand the slope of stairs, you understand that this slope right here is a lot more than 1 in 20. Same thing with this ramp. And then if you do negotiate this ramp, okay, what happens at this last step? You got to think about these kinds of things. And this is what you find out in the real world. Here you've got curb ramps. Curb ramps lead from an accessible route past a curb. Well, you can't have an obstacle like this grate here that has these entrances, these wheelchair catch-alls to stop that person trying to negotiate getting into this crosswalk to cross the street. Ramps, accessible routes, slopes, cross slopes, they can all be measured with a digital level. And that's because you have specific measurements, 2.08% slope maximum for a cross slope in accessible routes, 5% on the running slopes on those accessible routes. Here you see a contractor that's actually got one that's magnetized, that's stuck to his screed when he's putting in the concrete to make sure he follows that slope criteria. These are all very important things that you have to think about. Edge protection on ramps. You've got handrails. They have specific criteria as far as height, size, spacing. If you have a handrail like this on a ramp, you cannot have a ramp that does not have some kind of edge protection. The primary two edge protections are a lower bar that is no more than 4 inches above the ground so that the front wheels of that wheelchair can't run off past that. If you don't have that bar, you have to have at least 12 inches to the edge of the ramp. By doing that, it makes this particular ramp code compliant. But there are also things called landing zones or landing strips, landing areas. When you come up this ramp here, you have to be able to come up to a flat level surface without having to try and turn, because right here, trying to negotiate turning while going up this slope, this is just an accident waiting for this individual to tip over and fall. You also have parallel curb ramps. This is where this walkway comes up to a flat level surface, and then you can turn left or turn right and go up to separate ramps. As long as they don't have a slope over 1 in 12, you're good to go. Detectable warning strips are on curb ramps, and those are those generally bright yellow pads that have the raised dimples, which all have a specific criteria. They generally have to go across the width of the opening. They have to start 6 to 8 inches from the edge of the curb, and they have to be at least 24 inches deep. These are not required by code at this time. However, The right-of-way guidelines that exist out in the world are recommending strongly, and it has been pre-approved that these detectable warning strips will become mandatory on the next code change that exists, which at this time we don't know when that is. Chapter 5, General Site and Building Elements. This is where you get into your parking, and this again is something that's very important for you to pay attention. There's a lot of different conditions and situations. Normally accessible parking spaces have to be 8 feet wide. You have to have a 5-foot wide accessible path adjacent to it, and it can be on either side. It doesn't have to just be on the right side, because now they've got cars that will offload on the left side. For vans have to be 8 feet wide, but it can be 8 feet wide, but you have to have an 8-foot wide adjacent accessible path and route adjacent to it. However, if you have an 11-foot wide aisle, you only have to have 5 feet. Now, I say this for a very specific reason. As an example here, these two add up to 16 feet. These two add up to 16 feet. However, in the state of Florida, which is one of the only few states that have this, they have minimum parking widths of 12 feet for all vehicles. So just about every accessible parking space you find in the state of Florida is going to follow these guidelines, because nobody ever looked at the specific criteria pertaining to Florida alone. The point is, you have to look in your individual state, your specific jurisdiction, and see what the criteria is in your area. There's a reason for marking the accessible aisles. This is not it. We put a barber pole indication there saying, trying to indicate that there's no parking there, but you can't put anything beyond people these days. They don't understand. We have specific criteria for the parking signs. They have to be a minimum of 60 inches to the bottom of the sign. If you have a van accessible space, there's a small van sign that goes underneath this, but now that means the whole thing has to raise up so that 60 inches is the minimum height to the bottom of that van sign. The access aisles are adjacent and adjoin the accessible route. They normally have to be the full length of the parking space. They have to be 60 inches wide. They can't have any changes in level that are over 1 in 48. They're marked to discourage the parking. You can't help this situation. All you can do is mark it and hope that people understand that they're not supposed to put anything there. The people who understand that mostly are the people who are physically challenged or have a family member or friend who are physically challenged, and they see the difficulties they have. If you want to learn how difficult it is, just go to any public place, find someone who is physically challenged, and just lay back and watch how they negotiate the built environment. It is very, very challenging. Access aisles, what works here? Well, you've got an access aisle here that is shared between the two handicap spots, and it has a marked area that goes across over to the building. Over here, you've got all these access aisles that come to one long one that comes up here to this ramp up to the sidewalk. Those are things that work very well. But if you don't follow these rules and guidelines, you're going to have accidents. And this is something that you don't want to see anybody have an accident, but especially someone who's in a wheelchair. That's just not a pleasant thing to think about. Grab bars, they have very specific criteria too. I did an inspection on a facility once. They said they wanted me to check out their accessible parking spaces. I said, well, while I'm here, how about if I check out your bathroom? They said, no, we're opening tomorrow. We've already built it. We had an architect design it. We know we're good. And I said, well, I'm here. Let me just go on ahead and take a look at it for free. And they said, okay, go ahead. So he thought that his bathrooms were in perfect ADA compliance. I went in there and found 33 violations. Just saying, there's a lot to pay attention to. Handrails, they have to extend at least 12 inches beyond the top and bottom step. This does not make it. Chapter 6, Plumbing Elements and Facilities. This is where we're going to start getting into our toilet and bathing facilities. In the old days, they used to just have a 60-inch turning radius. They thought that as long as you had a 60-inch turning radius, that you could negotiate with a wheelchair, you were in good shape. Now they've realized that because of space constrictions and restrictions, it's become more challenging. So they've added what they call the T-shape turning space. The theory behind this is that you can take and turn in here, back up, and then pull back out again. So the T in ADA is now an option. Children's toilets, they have their space and height and size and location criteria. Where drinking fountains are provided, that has always been fairly easy to see and notice these days. They always have two of them side by side, typically, the one lower for the ADA. But now they also have drinking bottle locations because everybody seems to be drinking out of water bottles. So they have these bottle filling stations, and they're like everything else, they have specific criteria that come into play. Water closet locations, these are very specific. They have to be located 16 to 18 inches to the center line of the wall to the nearest wall on the side. I just got done having an old client call me back up or call me up saying they had a new facility they wanted me to look at. I told them I didn't do that anymore. They said, well, it was something simple. They said they had someone go in and file a lawsuit because they were 18 and 1/8 inches away from the wall. People, I don't make this stuff up. It's something that's real, and it happens every day. Doors, they have specific criteria. Uh, all the fixtures in a bathroom have specific criteria. They have to be certain height. They have to have certain kind of lever action hardware. What is acceptable about this picture that you don't see in this picture? Well, obviously there's something in the path here, and this has some bare exposed pipes. Now, you might not think that that's anything serious or concerning. However, someone who is physically challenged, a lot of times they don't have any feelings in their legs. And if they come up and roll up underneath one of those uh, counters or one of those lavatories and the pipe is hot, they can actually get some pretty serious third-degree burns. So necrosis is a big problem that you have to pay attention to. Communications. A lot of times, wayfinding signs are a saving grace for you because there are certain clauses in the ADA code on certain elements that say you have to have this particular thing identified. If not, if you don't have access, if you don't have the ability to get in here, you need to at least have wayfinding signs that say, hey, you've got handicap access in the back of the building. Here is the accessible route. Here is the accessible entrance. If you have these wayfinding signs, it's a pretty cheap way of fixing a particular problem if you don't have that accessible entrance, for an example, right at the location that leads from the parking lot to the building. Special rooms and special elements, they get a lot into transient lodging. There's a lot of specific criteria there. Built-in elements in the built environment in these buildings. There's a lot of different criteria as far as the spaces that have to be handicap accessible, there's guidelines, at least 5%, but not fewer than one. The tables have to be ADA compliant. The counters have to be ADA compliant. You've seen this probably where they'll have a lower section in a counter so that someone can wheel up alongside and write a check or hand them a credit card, that kind of thing. Recreation facilities are the same thing. They've got a lot of specific criteria that come into play here. They talk a lot about safe harbors. Elements that do not benefit from safe harbors, they're listed here: play areas, swimming pools, miscellaneous, team or player seating. Swimming pools have very specific criteria. It's not just a matter of having a chair lift to lift someone out of their wheelchair and set them down into the water. They can have sloped entries inside the pool. It's like an underwater ramp if you're not aware of those. Play areas, they get into a lot of the criteria there. You have to determine if your playground equipment is ground level or elevated. There's criteria that list what those different criteria are. Then you get to the end, and it's good to know that if you are going to be a facility manager or someone who's in charge of their building and you want to start looking at the ADA and understanding, and you're more of a visual person, they do have animations that were produced by the U.S. Access Board, and you can look these up online, and they are 5 to 8 minute videos that talk about all these different things, what maneuvering spaces are, accessing toileting fixtures, those protruding objects I mentioned, parking, access bathing, doors. All of these are items that you can look up and watch the video yourself anytime you want. Finally, we have some ADA fails. These are pictures that I've had that I've acquired over the years. They are not hard to see. They are not hard to understand. But it's amazing when you go out there and you see these things. So here we had a tenant that they had a couple of offices and they wanted to block this door off. They said it wasn't important, so they went on ahead and let the building people put in a handrail across there. And I said, well, what are you going to do if you leave and the next people want to open that door up? You know, you have to think about these things. Minimum widths into doorways. They've got that minimum width for a reason. These wheelchairs have a certain size. They need to be able to get through there. I don't understand. All I can know is that, you know, putting a telephone pole in the middle of an accessible parking space is not the way to go. Maybe they had visions of relocating this parking space to a different location. That would be the fix. But while they're at it, they need to raise the sign up. I can tell that's not 60 inches minimum. Reach ranges, common sense. I don't know. You'd have to be Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to be able to reach this toilet paper holder. Again, going up a little curb ramp into a pole. I don't know. These are real pictures. These are not photoshopped. Again, the reach range. I've got pretty long arms, but I don't think they're that long. This is interesting. They wanted to provide a ramp for the physically challenged people in wheelchairs, but I don't know how they're supposed to negotiate these first two steps to get to that ramp. Here they've got a parking space, an accessible parking space with an adjacent aisle, but then they have these stairs. Where's the ramp? No signage indicating where the ramp is. Wayfinding signs would have helped. I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to be able to figure out that that accessible ramp there is not that accessible. Here, they at least made an attempt for a minute. They put in the temporary ramps here to get up these two steps, but then they put in this big sign here, keep clear for wheelchair users. I don't know, folks. That's common sense. and it never ends. I used to find these every single day on all my jobs. You know, here it would have been a lot better to either put in a temporary ramp that went right up the center that had a nice flat landing area, or a wayfinding sign that says, hey, go around to the back of the building. So understanding all these different complexities and code criteria is to make you understand that there are risks, and these risks usually manifest themselves in the form of lawsuits. Title II and Title III specifically prohibit the places of public accommodation of not providing the safe usage of these buildings and the access to them for people with disabilities. The standards are based on ADA guidelines, what we call the ADAG, which are enforced by the Department of Justice, the Department of Transportation, and the courts, and apply nationwide. So, what are the risks of not being ADA compliant? Well, the current greatest risk is litigation based on the violation of people's civil rights. These people with disabilities. There are Department of Justice fines and penalties that are assessed for violations, and they range from $75,000 for the first offense to $150,000 for the second and all subsequent offenses. Okay, the last job I did before I came to Roth, I found a job that had a lawsuit that I ended up having to provide expert witness testimony in, and they had 18 violations. Okay, $150,000 times 18, that's a lot of money. Missing or non-compliant signage is the number one violation found throughout buildings in the built environment these days. All you got to do is put up a couple of $15 signs and it alleviates a lot of your problems. There were over 11,472 ADA lawsuits in the United States in 2023, and this number just keeps going up every single day. So, what are the risks of not being ADA compliant? Well, you've got the lawsuits to contend with. You've got the fact that you could be the one responsible for someone getting hurt, maybe someone you know, maybe a family member or friend, because your building wasn't ADA compliant. So now that I've demonstrated that there's a lot that you have to pay attention to, what do you do now? Well, the most important thing that you need to do is you need to have someone assigned as your ADA representative, your go-to person who is responsible for obtaining all the information necessary to become ADA compliant for your building or facility. Then you need to develop a self-evaluation assessment checklist. The checklist is very important. It's going to be the guide that's going to help you go through and look at all the items in your particular location that are going to help you understand what is a violation, what is not a violation, and what you need to do about it to fix it. Performing a self-evaluation assessment of your building then is next to determine the accessible barriers that exist, and then use that information to develop your transition plan. Determining the priority of all your barriers that you identify in that assessment and the time frame to correct them, as well as the funding necessary to pay for them, would be the next step before you do the final step in your development of the transition plan, which is filing it with your state. You have to remember that the transition plan is a living, breathing document. You are going to identify all of your barriers, establish when you're going to fix them, and then as you fix them, you are going to update that transition plan. By doing this, one of the things that it'll do, if you are filed with the state, identifying that you have recognized you have barriers and you have a plan to fix them and correct them, that is going to help alleviate you getting sued. And then when all else fails, when you want to learn the other things that can help you, you use your resources. Here are a bunch of those resources. The U.S. Access Board, the Department of Justice, Department of Transportation, all of these places have numbers, 1-800 numbers that you can use to call up and say, hey, I've got this situation. Can you help me? If you have a hard time getting through to them, as you do sometimes, you've also got other sources. You've got Roth IAMS. We can help. There's contact information on the last slide. Um, there's a lot of things that we can do to assist you. And by doing that, it is going to help you obtain happy, safe, and accessible individuals, which is going to give you the ADA compliance that is going to mean your success. So at this point in time, we're going to have questions and answers. I am putting up a QR code here, so if you would like to take your phones out and scan this code, it'll give you all the additional information you need to assist you with becoming ADA compliant. There will be a survey at the end of this here, so if you would not mind taking a moment just to fill out the couple of questions that we have at the end, that would be greatly appreciated. While you're thinking of your questions, let me just show you here real quick. Here is an example of an ADA checklist that is provided free of charge online. We can get you a copy of this. It talks about all the different criteria. Here it shows you the different criteria for parking spaces. Is it accessible, yes or no, based on the description? You can put in photos. You can take and look at the criteria to take and fix this particular item, and it goes through everything in the code that you need to be aware of, everything that you would need. So if you have any questions and would like to get a copy of that, please feel free to give us a call.
Johnny, it doesn't look like we've got any questions in the chat yet. So if anyone does have a question, please get it in and we will get Johnny answering it. Johnny, could you flip to the next slide that shows your contact information so people can grab that if they want to reach out to you?
Yes.
Okay, it doesn't look like we've got any questions in the chat. So we can wrap up the webinar for today. Thank you, Johnny, for the great presentation. And thanks to everyone who joined us. As requested, please do fill out the poll, and that will help us bring you more webinars. So that's it.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.